Welcome back, everyone. Today we're continuing on our Framelock folder series. This is part 3. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to catch up, you can go back and look at parts 1 and 2. I'll leave a link in the description. On the last video, we got our frames cut out, profiled, and we got our pivot drilled and reamed. We got our frame screws drilled and counterbored, and we located our stop pin hole. We also cut out and roughly shaped our back spacer, drilled the holes, and tapped them. And now it's time to go ahead and do our counterbores for our pivot head and our bearings. We also need to drill our stop pin hole and ream it out and get it ready. Right now, let's go down the table, talk about tools we're going to use for this and how we're going to do it. I know this video series is long-winded, but I'm trying to do a detailed series here so you can really see what I'm doing. I've got an old video, like I've mentioned before, where I've made a frame lock, but there's no detail in it. So I decided to do a series because I've had a lot of questions about it. So that's why they're long-winded. I'll try to do my best not to overtalk. As mentioned, we got the counterbores done for our 256 screws. These are drilled out to pass through. So you can see how the 256 button head fits in there really snug. When I contour these, some of this is going to go away. So I use temporary screws up until I start doing assembly. And I may have to even sink these a little further. Right now they're about 50,000, 60,000, somewhere about. And so we've got our back spacer drilled and tapped. And here's the parts that we're going to be cutting our pockets for. I'll be using a decorative screw head for my pivot. So it'll be something like this, not this one. I use this for assembly. I'll have a pivot, I'll have bearings, and I'll have thrust washers. Not really a thrust washer, but the washer will go against the titanium for the bearings to roll on. They're hardened 20 thousandths thick washers. Now, you don't have to design a knife that has to have bearings. Like I've said before, you can design one without a pin track in it, just have a stop pin, but it has to be designed for it. And this is kind of a prototype knife to begin with. I've been making it several years, but I've changed things up many times, and I'm still changing things. I've actually went to a smaller bearing size in diameter, still 3/16. I'm also doing a hidden pin where the screw is not exposed on the outside like this one is. So my stop pin has a screw there. So when the blade opens, the pin is right in there. I'm going to have this one hidden on the show side all the way. The only thing you'll see on the lock side is a little hole where I use to drill to line up the stop pin location. What we have to do is cut our bearing pockets. I'll do that first. I want to cut the bearing pockets to leave enough room for 20 thousandths on each side, since I'm using 20 thousandths washers. And the back spacer needs to be the same thickness as your blade, plus whatever gap you're going to have there, which is going to be 20 thousandths on each side, so 40 thousandths. So you have to do a little math. Each knife is different in thickness. It's custom made, it's handmade, so you have to take all that into account. They're all numbered, so I know which pattern, which blade goes with which pattern, and that's just the way handmade is. CNC is a lot different. Now, I don't always use bearings in all of my knives. A lot of my liner locks have washers, like phosphorus bronze or nylitron. I just cut my washers out of nylitron. It's about 15 thousandths thick, very smooth and slippery material, kind of like Teflon. It just depends on your knife style or what you're going to use for your blade to ride against. I like to use bearings in these frame locks. So to cut the bearing pockets, I'm going to be using a counterbore. There's a pilot that goes in where the pivot hole is and cuts the radius of your bearing on the outside. These things are expensive. They're probably close to 90 or 100 bucks. I can't remember. I'll leave a link in the description. I'm pretty sure, matter of fact, these came from USA Knife Maker. They are expensive. You don't have to have them. I made a bunch of them with just using a end mill and lining it up with a pin here first and milling it out. Matter of fact, this is the end mill that I used for a long time to cut my bearing pocket. I would first line up with a 3/16 hardened pin in my mill, take it out, not moving my X and Y, put in this end mill and cut the pocket. It works. You just have to be extremely tight with your setup. So what I'm going to do is take some measurements and do our counterbore for our bearing, and we'll cut our pivot head countersink on the other side using the same method. I'll measure the thickness. Okay, I got one of the scales set up in the mill here. Remember to mark your insides and outsides, because once you cut it, you're done. So I've got the inside of the scale mounted here, and I've got my counterbore lined up with the pinhole. So I'm going to use my DRO to bore this down to 62 thousandths. Manufacturer's got 68 thousandths on the package of the bearings, but I don't know who measured that, but they need to lay off the bottle. And as I mentioned in the last video, you can use a drill press to do this. And I showed an example of a makeshift DRO that I made to fit that drill press. Now they have some made for drill presses, but I used a set of digital calipers to do that. It is not easy, but you can do it. And I've got the scales sanded to 400 grit on the inside, so I want to protect them. I've got some brass here, but I don't want to scratch them up. Titanium is a booger to clean up. So let's get started. All right, I got a little bit of problem, but I'm able to fix it the old-fashioned way. Problem is, as I mentioned, I went to a different bearing size, which is smaller in outside diameter. So I had to get the counterbore for that bearing. So I'm no longer using the bearings I normally use or the counterbore. But it turns out that the bearings are 2 thousandths larger than the counterbore for those bearings. Again, somebody don't know how to take measurements. And of course, I won't be recommending that counterbore or the bearings because they come from the same place. I'll go back to my old bearings and counterbores that I can count on. So what I'm having to do is I'm gonna line it up the old-fashioned way and then bore out the pocket with a end mill like I used to do. Like it works, but like I said, it takes longer to set up. But I'm gonna show it to you. I'm gonna go ahead and use the counterbore that I bought for those bearings to line up because it's got the pin size correct. And then I will bore it out with a end mill that's the right size. So that's why I call this pattern my prototype. I'm still playing with it after a few years. So I'll probably go back to my old bearings. So let's get it started. Okay, with our bearing pockets milled, which took twice as long because of the bearing size diameter larger than the counterbore that's made for it. Go figure. That's what I get for changing bearings and not testing my counterbores before I start to work. But now it's time to mill our pivot heads, and I've got a specific size for that. You can see here how that'll go. Fits in there very nice. You got about 2 thousandths clearance. Can't really see that, but that's what it is, which is perfect. Note to suppliers. Thickness I'm gonna go down with this specific cap head is about 60 thousandths. I'm gonna go right down to the top of the lip of this screw, but all of this depends on what you use, your hardware, and what kind of counterbores or mills that you use. So this one, for example, is much larger. You know, you have to profile these to the shape you want, but it's different. I have a different mill for that. So I'll get those cut. Then I'm gonna come in here with a 0.120 drill and drill down about 50 thousandths into the scale to cut our stop pin holes. Then I'll ream it to a 0.120. Then I'll cut the stop pins to length once I figure that out, get the back spacer sized and everything. Okay, we got pretty much everything we want to do on the frame for right now. What I want to do next is go ahead and get our stop pin cut and adjust our blade, the length of our pivot pin cut, and clean up the inside of our backspacer. But what you want to do is make sure that when you assemble your knife in here, you want your pivot to be slightly below the bottom of your bore where your pivot head goes. And I'll try to show a close-up of that. But if your pivot's even, it'll bottom out and you can't tighten your pivot. It'll just spin your pivot. So you got to have a little room to tighten it up. So I'm talking like 5/1000ths maybe. You'll take these apart and put them back together 100 times at least. So I've already adjusted this one. This is my stop point up and down. It's just slightly below here where it don't stick the finger. And it's not hitting my backspacer because I've already cleaned it up. So without the lock bar cut, it's starting to look like a knife. All right, so that's what we're going for. All right, I got my stop pin length cut, and now I need to trim the ends of the track so I can adjust the height and the closure. I left a little there to do this. You can do this on a drill press, and it's why I've got it set up this way. But like I said, doing it on a drill press is pretty sketchy because you'll loosen up the taper on your Jacobs chuck and it can fall out. So I'm not recommending it. I'm just showing you. You can take something just like this, mount it on your drill press, and you can cut this whole track. But I'm going to come in here and adjust this. I've got my screw loose there. I've got a pin coming up through, a pivot pin. Normally I would lock this down and just trim it, but I wanted to show you another way of doing this. I'm just going to come up here, move it, and bump it and trim it. So here we go. All right, so I trim it a little bit, and then I'm going to have to go check it. But that's how I would do it if I didn't have a mill. You can cut the whole track that way, like I said. Okay, I went ahead and cleaned up the backspacer on the inside, but I'm not finished there. I got to do some final polishing once I make sure it works fine with the blade closed. But I've got our stop pin trimmed, and I actually bored these holes down to 80,000 instead of 50. 50 is fine, just plenty, but I had the room, so I went ahead and did it. Now I want to get everything assembled up, make sure. So we're going to just assemble it. I've got a washer that goes down in here for the bearings to ride on instead of against the titanium. So we're going to put it together and see how it works. Okay, it's down in there where I want it to be. Now I still have to trim the outside of the backspacer and clean all this up, but it's down in there where it needs to be, where your finger won't hit the blade. It's not hitting the backspacer, and pretty close to where I want it to be in the open position. I've already took the backspacer and cut it to the thickness that I need to match the blade plus the gap here. If you don't do that, it's going to be out of square and bind. So your backspacer has to equal the thickness of your blade plus your space on each side. So now what I want to do is trim the pivot. So I've already cut this side. I still have to shape it. So I'm going to come here and mark the inside of the pivot where it comes out of the frame. I want this pivot, like I said before, when it's all the way in, to be slightly below where it exits the frame down in that bore hole. And that way your pivot won't spin when you tighten it up. It'll get tight. It gives it something to pull on and it doesn't bottom out. You have to take your time doing this. You don't want to overcut it, and you make a couple trips to the grinder doing it. Now there's several ways to do this. If you got a lathe, you can put it in a lathe and cut it, which is probably what I'll do. Or if you got a mill, you can put it in a collet block, stick it straight up, and use an end mill to cut it. Or mount your end mill in the vise and put this in a collet and mill it square, or you go over and grind it. I like to try to cut it square as possible. So what I'm gonna do is go get this cut, and then we'll do the fit up again, and we'll move on to the next step. All right, we're ready to move on to the next step, but I want to mention one other way that you can cut your pins and your pivot pins is with a drill press up against your belt sander. I've done it that way many times before I had a mill and a lathe. Just take your time. You can do it. Now, the next thing we're going to do is I've got the frames screwed together with the stop pin in and, of course, the back spacer. Now I want to clean up this back spacer. I want to get everything to final profile and cleaned up. One other thing I want to mention, while I was fine-tuning the tracks on number 2 blade, I overgrounded in the closed position. It would still work, but it sat too deep in there for me. I had to replace it with another blade that I already had made. I made 7 of them just for stuff like that. This really aggravates me because it's a different style. It's the drop point, and I wanted 2 of these in this batch. It really makes me mad. Now just... But yes, I could always use it on a future project if I use an oversized stop pin, and I've done that before. Just go with an oversized. I'm not drilling this one out and putting an oversized one in. So we're going to retire it for now. So let's go get these profiled and we'll move on to the next step. For the next step I'm going to do, I've got the back spacers out and I'm coming here and finish them up to their final finish. But more importantly, I'm going to come up here and soften this part at the front of the back spacer. When you flip the knife, your finger is going to rub across there and you don't want it to cut it. It's a sharp edge even though it's got a little radius. I'm not going to come back steep because then I'll have a gap there I don't want to see. But just soften it up to around 600 grit or so and get these things cleaned up just like that. All right, with the back spacers all cleaned up, all that's just working fine. I'll do a little more cleanup on the inside of the scales once I'm done with the next few steps. But now it's time to cut the lock bar. And you remember back in the first or second video, we marked our start and stops of our lock bar. Now I'm going to drill these with a number 44 bit. I won't be cutting or releasing the lock bar just yet because I got a lot more work to do and I don't want that springy. But I use a abrasive saw, and I learned this from Salem Straub several years ago. I was using metal saws and they just wore out too quick. I went to these after seeing something he posted a few years ago, and they work great. This is a new one, and this is one that's used, and this is after cutting 7 lock bars, just barely anywhere. So they hold up good. I run them slow, and they're about 40 thousandths thick. I think I get these or got these off of Amazon. They come with a 1/4 inch arbor, and you can see I think that's like a 3/8 hole there. Yes, 3/8. It has a low profile nut, so you can get down low, close to your vise, and cut and not have to worry about hitting anything. Now, you don't have to drill holes in here. You could just cut it, but I just like the way it looked. If I was having these water jetted, it'd be a different story. It's a lot cleaner. Doing it this way doesn't come out as clean if I don't drill them holes, and just gives it a little neatness to each end. So right now I'm going to take a number 44 bit, go drill them, then we'll set it up in the vise on the mill, and I'll show you that setup and we'll make the cut. Okay, I've got it set up in the vise here, and I wanted to show you how I set it up before I started cutting. Got a couple parallel bars there with a couple bits in the pinholes to set it up level. You can use whatever you want there, but this works fine to set it up level. They're the same size bits. Then I will center the saw in that line and make the cut. I'm just making sure that my nut for the saw clears here. It also has to clear, all the way around, because I got to cut, move around, and cut again to get where the radius of the saw doesn't get into. I want to cut clear through into that hole. Got to take your time to do that. So we'll go ahead and get her cut. So with the lock bars cut, what I like to do is come in here and I take a half round file, needle file, and I put the round side down and I clean this up in here and then put a little 600 grit paper on there and I do it on both sides and that softens it up. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and relieve the lock bar down to about 50 thousandths, actually about 45 thousandths. That's a sweet spot to me. And that'll allow the spring to work without being too hard against the blade, but yet strong enough to hold it. And I'll be using a ball end mill to do that. Come down here and mill it, and then we can cut our lock bar, release it. And like I said, you don't have to have a mill to cut this slot. I showed a tool in the first video in this series on what I used to cut them with. It works fine. Like I said, I used to make these frame locks with a drill press and just some tools I had made before I had a mill, surface grinder, any of that stuff. So once I relieve it, I'll cut the lock bar and finish these up on the inside up to their final finish. Still got a little ways to go, and so I'm not worried about the outside too much right now. I don't want any deep gouges there, but still a lot of work left to do. And we'll have to pick that up on the next video. We're out of time. If you got any questions, comments, leave them down below. I'll leave links in the description for tools that I can find that I've used here. But I want to thank my patrons, and I want to thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one.